available to the owner. And it's implemented, it's kind of finicky, and it's kind of a technical specialty area of law. There's rules, and there are appraisers who are equipped to do these appraisals, and they're different than the appraiser who drives by your house for a mortgage. They're especially trained and experienced appraisers to do this kind of work. Okay, I've probably missed a chance to get coffee. Let's take a quick break. I'm going to see if I can get some nice coffee. Let's be back at like 2:10. Okay. Okay. We're going to spend a lot of time on this. I know it feels like we're not even getting.
What's up, Chief? I'm on a break. What's going on? You want me to go that way?
That's it. It's okay.
Chantel. What's up, Chantel?
Did you raise them?
No.
No? Okay. Do you know them from?
Hmm?
Do you know them?
I know them from up here, actually.
Huh?
I know them from up here.
Ah,
Yeah. I went to school with the younger one, with Jaime Jr.
Okay.
And, I also know the Cisneros family.
Huh?
The Cisneros.
She got a nice house
Ricky.
off there, but
Yeah, I know.
it wasn't.
Yeah,
She's a
well, there's Ricky Gustavo.
I'm happy to have her.
My father went to school with Ricky.
Area, but it's a beautiful area.
Yeah.
Right in the city.
Victoria, a friend of hers, Victoria Bronco, lives near me.
I hope you can see it. I moved
Yeah,
out
no, I'm
of
not
the
They're good people.
southeast.
They're good people.
Very
I think
different.
they caught up with Panama papers.
Yeah. Oh,
With
yeah.
all that nonsense, yeah.
Well,
Because Jaime Sr. was heavily involved in
Oh, yeah, sure.
law down there, and then he had law firms, and then he was the ambassador, right? Or is it, is the ambassador the
Oh,
I know his grandfather ran for president, young Jaime was gonna run for president. And once that happened, we moved down there, and went down there.
Recently, I was like, normally they're like 8 to 10. It's very something. 10 minutes. I look around and I see 40, 50, 60 people.
When did you make it?
And they still keep coming.
Last Saturday.
That's right. Because
Everybody's walking around with their phones in their hands.
I was in just
Pokemon.
Now,
No, I just.
to me, that's affecting.
No,
I
you know
like-
where it's at, right?
You know,
Yeah, she's down the street.
I think that the game is fading already.
I actually ordered
So
it online.
I think it's a self-correcting problem,
I hope so.
but there were lots of people, because, for example, my husband works
We will let you know.
as the IT director for a church and school, and the church was in the game as a gym,
Yes.
a place where you had to come, I don't know what you had to do. And so it's a school with kids, and strangers kept going in and doing this
I don't
nonsense.
think we're gonna
Um,
need it in the future.
And
That was.
they found a solution. There was somebody who worked there who was very evangelistic, and he went and handed out tracts, and they would all leave.
We have fun for, yeah.
But
They're
it's,
still coming.
no, but it's fading because the game is, I'm told it's not working as well. It's like there are technical problems with how the game works and other things. I don't know, have you played?
yeah, I played it.
Yeah.
Just for sake of it and also some stuff. But yeah, a lot of technical problems which are not being dealt with in the company, and just a lot of backlash from the other communities. So it's like with any game like that. There will always be the popularity surge and just go down after a while.
But for me, I didn't like what was going on. But it's still going on in my area.
No, I'm talking with mom.
Yeah,
Really?
Say no,
Oh.
don't get caught up.
I think that because of the nature of those kind of games, it's gonna self-correct. You know, people lose interest in them.
And it's also interesting because I've been up in the Boston and New York area, and some businesses where these stops work or gyms, they actually set up like ways you can help with these gamers who come to the location and actually help boost the revenue.
Revenues, right?
55 minutes.
So some people like it. They want to know how to make their location more prominent in the game to draw people. Yeah, that's true.
But of course, there have been downsides too, where there have been like injuries and deaths from playing the game.
You're from Fort Lauderdale?
I was born in Minneapolis, but I've been here since I was a kid, so I guess I have to sort of.
What do you think of the Bahia Mar expansion and the Galleria?
It looks like a great project to me, but I haven't been directly involved. I'm just looking to see.
What do you think, Galleria Mall? Yeah, Galleria Mall, they're doing a huge overhaul, they're doing outdoor spaces.
All the malls are expanding right now.
Yeah, there's a 55, I think it's 55 stories.
Oh
Going
my
on.
God, it's gonna be crazy.
I know, and I live right there, and
That's
Baby's
gonna
gonna
be
be
crazy.
packed.
Pavey's always packed.
But in the end of the day, I guess,
I mean, Fort Lauderdale is struggling with whether it really wants to be a city or not.
I know it's a little city.
You know,
but
it's always been a mid-rise, sleepy little town, and there's a few significant buildings downtown. They're building one that's going to be the tallest. It's blocking my view. Thank you very much in my office. But they really struggle with what kind of city they want to be. I mean, I feel like Miami, for example, you know, they're all in.
Yeah.
They know what it means to be a real city, and they're becoming that. And you can build multifamily projects in the core of Miami with zero parking. Zero. You know, the assumption are micro units. The assumption is for the few people who want a car, they'll lease a public parking space
Or
somewhere.
Uber,
Hmm?
Uber everywhere.
Or they Uber, they use transit, they use bicycles, they walk, because it's becoming a real city, but Fort Lauderdale is just not there yet. So height is troubling in Fort Lauderdale.
There was something recently I read, maybe a week ago, stating that east of Federal, they wanted to stop the amount of projects above, I believe, 8 stories in height. I don't know how accurate it is, because it was in the real deal, but
I mean, I would say that's probably in some areas.
yeah, they're trying to limit it east of Federal, I want to say Rio Vista, Coral Ridge, east.
But not along Sunrise Boulevard. And, you know, there's,
Oh, right, because it cuts
I mean,
east
there-
west of,
it's,
well, Federal cuts east.
Yeah. The visions change over time too. You know, the planning vision that was there 10 years ago has changed over time. But they have a downtown that's really, the only constraints on when you build downtown is whether there are units in the pool available. And you can do reduced parking and no parking in the downtown regional activity center, it's called. But that's what the visioning process is. None of these plans work. Nobody buys into them if they don't go out into the community and develop a vision that has some consensus.
Sorry, you ran out of coffee.
I wonder why.
We drained it.
This one cup.
That's all he needed.
One that I was able to do,
Did you encounter him in business dealings back then? Oh, that's all.
Then just copy.
Ah,
Until I branched out and became my own business.
no. Two. Okay. All right. Remember when we were talking about contributions? You know, the idea that you want to build a project and somebody in the government says, yeah, but you need to contribute something towards the public realm. You need to include a public space that people from outside your project can use. Or you need to give us some land for a park, or land for a school, or for a road. That those kind of requirements that a local government will put on a project during the approval process, or they'll condition it. There comes a time when those requirements, the little part of your brain that measures fairness says that's just too much. They're asking for too much. It's going too far. That feeling, that sense of, you know, government, you can ask me for something, but what you're asking me for is disproportionate for the size of my project, leads to a line of cases called regulatory takings.
Yeah, well, what happens in a condition like that? I mean, we have a client we've been working with who's gonna build himself a new warehouse, he owns a piece of property. He wasn't necessarily being advised, you know, and wasn't aware that he signed an agreement, you know, basically saying that you're going to improve the, you know, the water main and the sanitary, lateral coming down a street, which is disproportionate, but he's already signed it, right? Once you sign these things, your property's bound to this.
I mean, you hire a lawyer and you go back and you try to roll it back. But yeah, that's the kind of example. It's just, and water and sewer agreements, I've seen local governments be pretty greedy in water and sewer agreements. Where sometimes they say, even if you're not ready to build, and we want to extend the water line early, we're going to come tap you on the shoulder and we want you to pay in advance. And you're like, because in theory, you can get a project approved and you realize that the market has changed or the conditions are just too onerous and your investors pull out for whatever reason. You decide, I'm just not doing this project. But once you sign an agreement that says they can tap on your shoulder and make you pay for the water even though you don't need it, you're kind of in trouble at that point. So those agreements can be very grasping. But when the effect of regulation is so disproportionate to a particular piece of property, you can bring a regulatory takings case, that's what it's called. So what do these words mean? We've already talked about condemnation. So condemnation means that the government can take your property, pay you for it, and own it. But this, we're talking about a taking, but the government's not exactly taking your property. What they're doing is burdening it. They're imposing requirements on it that are costly. And those kind of challenges are called regulatory takings, or the other name for them is inverse condemnation. So inverse meaning the government's not taking, but what the government is doing is having the effect of taking. It's a reverse. Concept kind of, I'm talking about the same thing in a number of different ways because conceptually some of us get it one way and some of us get it another way. So if regulations go too far, they can be found to be a taking even though the government never took title to land. And they're a taking because the burden of the regulation is deemed to be too great. So a regulatory taking or an inverse condemnation occurs when a government regulation has the effect of destroying all or substantially all of a property's value. It seems simple, but where you draw the lines, it can be very complex. So again, we have to ask, what is the property that's being affected? So if, I'm trying to think of a good example. There's a Florida Supreme Court case that I'm going to have you read that is about wetland regulation. So you own a piece of property and you know that a lot of it is wet. Let's say you've got 20 acres and you know that a lot of it is wet and you're going to leave it alone, but you want to put a convenience store on an acre of it. And the government says, okay, but you have to give us the other 19 acres. You're like, what? That seems disproportionate. But when they fire up their lawyers and then the government's lawyers get fired up, the question first is, what is the property that we have to measure the effect? Is it the whole 20 acres? And you look at that and you say 19 acres for 1 acre of development, that's disproportionate. That's just not right. But you know, he acquired it over a period of time in 5-acre increments. Is it only the 5-acre increment around the 1 acre that he wants to develop? Is that really the property? Maybe it's okay to acquire 15 acres in order to develop 5 acres because he acquired them at different times and accumulate. Is it the whole property? Or at one point he had 40 acres and he sold off 20 to his neighbor. But you know, that's the property that should be considered in order to make this evaluation, the 40 acres. Because he had enough land to preserve the wetlands and still develop once upon a time. That's what I mean by what is the property, is that question. Yeah.
Is that what it mediate
That's what they call it, mitigation.
Mitigation, yes, mitigation. Is it reasonable to require someone to perform that degree of mitigation for that degree of development? That's the question. So what is the property is one of the first questions in evaluating, is this a regulatory taking? How much value is lost that is attributable to the regulation? Is the property worthless because it's a swamp and it's always been a swamp? And should you be able to develop it at all? You knew when you bought it was a swamp? What made you think you were ever going to get to build anything on it? You have to take the land the way you get it. That doesn't mean you have a right to build on it. I don't know, that's the question. Or because a regulation prohibits placing fill in the swamp. So, is the property worthless because it's a swamp and it's always been one? Or is it worthless because the regulation prevents you from filling the swamp? Those are the difficult issues that are dealt with in a regulatory takings case. When the loss of value results from multiple regulations, which government is responsible? So the city says you can only build to 8 stories. Okay, the scenario that you were talking about. For years, for 20 years, everybody in this zone of the city was allowed to build to 15 stories. The city gets a new vision and they would like to lower heights, so they rezone it all and say it's now maximum 8 stories. Everybody around you had a right to build to 15 stories and they did, but you're now subject to a new regulation that says 8 stories. And also, the South Florida the drainage entity, which is a state agency, says that you can no longer store water in an open drainage pond. You have to build cisterns under the building, and that's way more expensive. And the school board says that the schools are too crowded and you can't build residential unless you pay for the cost of new student seats in the school. So you've got different regulators who are all touching this land and making the development of the land more costly. The city commission that said the zoning needs to change, the state agency that said the way that you store stormwater needs to change, and the school board that said you need to accommodate the additional students that you're going to create. If all of that combines to make it impossible to build on that land, can you sue anyone and get compensation? None of them individually would destroy the value of the land. But let's say that you've got experts to say that all of them cumulatively would destroy. That's not an easy case. I don't honestly know what the answer to that case is. But that's part of the challenge of regulatory takings, is trying to find what is the tipping point to say that someone must either release us from the effect of this regulation or pay.
I'm dealing with something right now where I have a nuisance tree.
You have a what?
A nuisance tree that's gone into
Oh,
plumbing.
okay.
So we're going to remove the tree. And the city has given me 2 types of trees. Trees are running my life right now.
Yeah.
So,
They don't give you 2 types, they let you do different.
okay. Ben's actually dealing with them.
They have certain trees, I mean, you know, when you take down a tree, you gotta mitigate it, right? If it's got so many canopies, you have to replace it with
So
certain
many,
canopies.
yeah.
Or you have to plant them somewhere else, or donate to a tree fund.
But the trees are so big that they told me, I Google imaged them to see how big these trees are, that if I plant 6 of them on that property, it's gonna grow. It's gonna be a tree farm. So the alternative is to put money into the tree fund, which is an exacerbated amount because, you know, and then, I don't know, trees run my life. So how is that fair that they're gonna essentially deteriorate the value of this parcel with these huge trees that they're demanding?
Well, when you have an option, and this is why local governments do this, when you have an option to pay, then usually it's not going to be a regulatory taking, because let's say the value of the property is not going to be destroyed by you having to pay $3,000 into the tree fund
I feel like it's
to
extortion.
replace your
It's
trees.
like 20 grand probably.
There are
That's-
many experiences with local government, and you know, we all live in nice and lovely towns and cities because they do this in reality, but there are many experiences with local government when you feel like your pockets have been picked. Let's just put it that way.
One quick question relating to your question, your statement. Let's say you wanted to sell that property. Do you have to disclose that to the buyer?
You'd have to tell them that, or you're the broker, not me.
Well, I can tell you right now, I have another property where I removed a tree, and they said, you need to play, in place of that tree, you have, my actual house, they said you have to replace it with 8 foot tall trees that fit this category. And I said, well, what can I called them, I said, what can I do instead? Does the city want trees? And they said, maybe if you were to plant silver buttonwoods, we would look over this and measure calipers instead.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Instead of canopy?
Yeah. So they kind of, like, they force you in a certain direction, but I'm not gonna argue with them, I'm gonna plant the ones with the calipers.
Okay.
But I mean, these trees are ruining my life.
But that regulation that says that you can't remove a tree unless you replace the value of the tree, and that the value is the ecological value, that is in canopy and so on, that doesn't seem disproportionate in reality, does it?
Thank you.
And it's not going to destroy the value of your property. So complaining about the tree permitting process is probably not going to be a good regulatory takings case.
It's a diseased tree you can remove.
A regulatory taking, so regulatory takings arise when the effect of regulation is not an overt taking where the property changes hands, but the effect of the regulation on the property is to so diminish the value that it's found to be invalid. It's just not, it's not valid. It's a de facto taking of land because the regulation impacts the value so disproportionately. The other way that these kind of cases occur is if the regulation itself just does not advance a legitimate governmental interest. And we're going to talk about the police power. But what you were describing, if early on, when local governments first began regulating trees, whether you could remove trees, that was a topic. Is it really a legitimate exercise of governmental power to protect trees? Somebody had to do the science to determine what the impact was on the public of the destruction of tree canopy. If, let's say that we used to have bubblegum machines on every corner, and they banned bubblegum machines. Someone would say, is it really a legitimate exercise of governmental power to prohibit people from chewing bubblegum? I don't know. I encountered this at an airport. I really wanted gum because my ears were popping, and the Orlando airport, I think, does not sell gum. They do not sell gum because they don't want gum on their floors.
Yeah, they don't want them on the tables, on the floor.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Good
and
regulation.
the the Disney hotels don't sell gum either, probably for the same reason. But a regulatory taking can occur if there was not a legitimate purpose for the regulation to begin with.
Yeah, this is another question. Are we gonna discuss Brownsfield?
Somewhat, yeah, and it could be that you can study it in your case study too. But we'll touch on brownfield development.
What is Brownfield?
Contaminated land.
It's
Contaminated?
the redevelopment of previously contaminated land.
Oh, okay. There's a big case like that in Chicago. I saw it on the news.
Okay, bring in articles. Maybe
Okay.
we'll have show and tell. You guys can tell me about it. You'll start seeing. You ever notice that when you're going to buy a new car and you're interested in a car, you think, "Wow, this would be a great car. I hardly see any of these on the road." And then all of a sudden, when you're interested in that kind of car, you see them
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Especially when you buy it.
So now, zoning cases. I'll be bringing some in. It's like through the whole year between the times I teach this class. I print off articles about zoning decisions around the country, so I'll start bringing them in. But now you're gonna start seeing them in the news, you're gonna start seeing them in what you read, you're like, dang, people fight about this a lot, I had no idea, right? Because you're gonna be aware of it now. Regulatory taking can also occur if the regulation does not advance a legitimate governmental interest. I'm trying to think of examples of that. And no good ones are coming to me right at the moment. But those are the two sides of it, that if the purpose of the regulation is not valid, or the impact on any particular piece of land is too harsh, then it can be deemed a regulatory taking. And a court is then saying that you, government, have effectively taken their land by regulating it to death. Okay, again, we're going to spend more time on all of these subjects, and we're going to spend a lot of time on zoning and the tools in zoning, and that'll feel much more practical to you. But I want you to understand the context in which zoning regulation operates. Planning. So planning in Florida. How many of you know a planner who works for a city, or you've had a meeting with a city planner before? Yeah. So on your project and on your construction, that's when you work on construction projects, that's all water under the bridge by the time you get involved typically.
Yeah, maybe done it once in 15 years, but
Okay.
yeah, it's usually already done by that time.
The premise of professional planning is that for a city to build great places, it requires a vision, an understanding of all the components that we've been touching on, how they're going to work together, and the practical issues of infrastructure. So what do we mean by infrastructure? Roads, bridges, water lines, sewer lines, sidewalks. Some would say schools are infrastructure. What other kinds of infrastructure are there? Libraries even?
When you say infrastructure, do you mean alternate modes of transportation, rail, bus?
Yes, yes.
Greenways.
Greenway, okay, so the bones of a city that we all move around on in a sense, and that we rely on. So other services, the fire station, the police station, that allows that service to be provided citywide as part of infrastructure. So all the components of a city: infrastructure, commerce, a mix of housing to serve different sized families, different incomes, open space, and recreation. And you might say historically, and I'm trying to think of a good example, like a good old 50s era movie of a strong mayor. It would have been managed in a small town setting by one or two people who had a vision for the town, and they basically told everyone what they were going to do and what they were not going to do.
Tammany, I think it was New York.
Yep, a small group of, but those were really, there were some government officials and some business people who formed.
Tammany,
Yep. Now, all of these concerns become part of, in states like Florida, which have growth management laws, in Florida suffered from the effects of overdevelopment and unplanned development. So the reaction in Florida was to become a strong planning state. Some other states that are like this, Oregon, Washington, California, had very strong movements to make planning part of the statewide regulatory structure. In Florida, we have a state comprehensive plan in statute, which is very, very generic. We're going to build good stuff, we're not going to build bad stuff. It's a little better than that, but it's very generic. The most significant thing about the growth management law in Florida is the mandatory requirement that local governments, that cities and counties, adopt comprehensive plans. And by making it mandatory, it was made mandatory and ignored, in spite of the fact that it was mandatory for many years. So finally, the legislature put some teeth behind it and said, if you don't do this, we're going to withhold money. So it got the cities and counties to finally adopt required comprehensive plans. The comprehensive plans in Florida become kind of like the development constitution. So the relationship between the Constitution and statutes, you know, the Constitution is hard to change. It governs, it controls over statutes. Statutes can be up for review annually. Legislatures and state legislatures, they change them all the time. They're allowed to do that, but the Constitution says what the outer limits of that are, of that action are. Comprehensive plans become like the Constitution for the local government with regard to development. They can change the regulations pretty easily, but they have to conform. They have to make sure that the regulations are consistent with the comprehensive plan. And they have to ensure that the projects that are approved are consistent with the comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan becomes hard to change, much more, it can be changed, and it is often, but it's more difficult to change than just the regulations. So that's how Florida put a growth management system into place. And it trickles down. Zoning existed for a long time, but comprehensive planning came into being in Florida because zoning just wasn't doing the job of creating beautiful communities that were well planned. Zoning was very local. There was no requirement initially that there be a context of a larger plan. So that's how, so you're gonna see, we're gonna talk about old zoning law and old zoning cases, and yet the comprehensive plan requirement in a state like Florida came in over on top of an existing zoning regulatory structure. Does that make some sense? Okay? So zoning back in the 50s was in place, and zoning occurring, rezoning, zoning approvals, all of that was in place. The legislature said, we don't think this is going very well. We have to put a superstructure in place to make sure that the process of approving development is given a little bit of a bigger thought. So then once a comprehensive plan in Florida is adopted, then everything that implements the plan must be consistent with it, and that's the watchword, is consistency. So the zoning must be consistent with the comprehensive plan, and all of the land development regulations must be consistent with, and they must further the local government plan. Environmental regulations, building permits, and the concept of concurrency. How many of you have ever heard the word concurrency in this context? Not familiar? It's a concept that says that infrastructure, remember we were talking about water, sewer, and those essential things, must be in place concurrent with the impact of development. That's all. So that's what became the term concurrency. You must meet or satisfy concurrency. It means you have to show that you're going to have water, sewer, streets, everything in place to address the impact of the development. So in Florida, just quick review, there's a state comprehensive plan, there's a statute that requires local governments to adopt comprehensive plans and withholds state money if they don't do it. And then once a comprehensive plan in a city or county is adopted, all of the development decisions made in that jurisdiction must be consistent with the comprehensive plan.
Is there not a boilerplate, but is there a format that the state prefers, or are there mandatory aspects of the comprehensive plan that?
Yes.
Are we gonna go over all this?
Yeah, there are mandatory elements. When this was adopted, let me see where my timeline is. So this history, so remind me, I wanted to go back and show you the cartoon. In 1972, the statute was first adopted. It established land and water management policies to guide and coordinate local decisions related to growth. And a statute was enacted called Developments of Regional Impact. So this was like the precursor to the 75 Comprehensive Planning Statute. In 1972, Florida did two things. They developed They realized that natural resources, and primarily water, I mean, it's a peninsula for goodness sake, the water is important here, were not being protected through local government decision-making, so they needed to adopt a comprehensive set of environmental regulations that would be enforced statewide. And they also adopted this thing called the DRI, Development of Regional Impact Statute. And what the DRI statute did was say, if you have a really big project, and then they defined what that meant, or a project that has an impact on multiple jurisdictions, you know, 2 cities next door to each other or something, then you have to go through a state level of review. And the state level of review is going to require you to study many, many, many things that your local government would not normally require you to study, and prove that your big development is going to fit in this community, and if you're causing negative impacts, that you're going to take care of those negative impacts. That was the gist of the DRI statute. How they defined big projects was always being tweaked. You know, if it's a commercial project with 100,000 square feet or more, and this and that and the other, or if it's an airport project, or if it's a residential project with more than so many thousands of dwelling units within per acre, they had very fiddly rules about what constituted a DRI. But if your project was a DRI, you had to go through DRI review. So those were the place settings that led to the adoption of the Local Government Comprehensive Planning Act in 1975. It first said, cities and counties, you must adopt comprehensive plans. And those comprehensive plans were supposed to study on a jurisdiction-wide basis many of the same issues that they made developers study in DRIs. So they were starting, as a state, the regulators were starting to learn, what do we wish that we knew before the heavy machinery actually moves in and starts moving dirt? What do we wish we had known about this? We'd like to know what the traffic impact would be, what all these areas of impact would be. But that 1975 Act was largely ignored. Most local governments, some of them did, but many of them did not adopt local comprehensive plans at all. They said, we've been making these decisions for ourselves for 100 years. We're going to keep making them. It's our tax base we're concerned about, so keep your nose out of our business. Then, in 1984, the state got serious. That's when they put some teeth into this law. It required the governor to prepare a state comprehensive plan, regional planning councils to develop regional policy plans. They created an agency statewide that was called the Department of Community Affairs to enforce this. And they put these consequences in place if local governments failed to adopt comprehensive plans. The consequences were withholding grant funds, yes, but they also gave the state agency the ability to go into court and fight decisions. So if a local government adopted a plan and ignored it and approved some development that was wildly inconsistent with the plan, the Department of Community Affairs could, require them to answer in a state administrative hearing, which is like similar to a court action. So it put some requirement in it, some teeth into it in 1984, 1985. In connection with the 85 Act, they adopted a whole set of technical rules. It was called Rule 9J5 back then, and it's largely been repealed now, but it told you exactly what you had to put in the comprehensive plan. And there was a whole regulatory infrastructure to get those plans written, adopted, reviewed, approved, challenged, if necessary, fixed, and implemented. And those minimum standards said you need to have a future land use map, and it needs to have this information on it. And you need to have a traffic circulation element, and it needs to have all this information and maps. And you need to have an element, a stormwater recharge element that says how you're going to deal with drainage, and it needs to have all this information. And it actually gave birth to a wide-ranging growth in planning as a professional endeavor. Local governments needed professional planners to prepare these, and developers needed professional planners to make sure their plans conformed. The state hired professional planners to implement all these regulations. It really took the concept of the professional planner and made them relevant in a government setting. Water, sewer, parks, all of these elements had to be covered in the comp plan. An interesting thing was that was challenging, because I became a lawyer in 1988, and some of the first work that I did was handling hearings to challenge the adoption of certain aspects of the Broward County Comprehensive Plan. They had to be internally consistent. So if your future land use map said that you wanted to permit very high density in an area, your parks and recreation element had to show that you were going to have sufficient parks in place to support that. See what I mean? Or your traffic circulation element had to show that you were going to build roads to serve that high density development. There had to be internal consistency between the elements.
What year was Rule RD5 repealed?
I can't remember. I think it was 2011. So we had like the heyday of growth management in Florida for a while. Yeah.
So why was the 9J5 was it too much of a burden for the local governments to adhere to? They can keep on track with the deadlines, or something else?
I think that there was a sense that that local governments came up to speed on all of this. The mandatory procedures of the Growth Management Act caused local governments to develop the expertise that they needed to do this kind of planning. And once they had that expertise, then the legislature felt that the decision-making should be returned more to the local government, and that the state should be less involved. They're not absent from the process entirely. They still have the ability to go into court and to challenge and do certain things to challenge a local government's comprehensive plan, and citizens do too. But the legislature believed, and it was mostly during the economic downturn, that the state was meddling in an area where it wasn't needed anymore, and that additional layer of development was causing a slowdown in development that would create jobs. So they kind of returned more authority back to the local governments in 2011.
Okay.
That's why. Was there another question? So the state comprehensive plan was adopted. The regional planning councils were in place mostly to review those DRI, those really big projects that I talked about, but they remained in place to kind of mediate between competing local governments and provide a regional level of planning review. In 1990, there was, again, a resurgence of concern for the environment in Florida, and the state committed money to the acquisition and protection of natural resources through the Florida Preservation 2000 Act. The funding for that has come and gone over time, but in reality, the state commitment to preservation has put a lot of environmentally sensitive land into public hands. In a sense, that's a balancing to the regulatory effort. To avoid regulatory takings or to avoid resistance to the regulation, it's nice when the state puts a little bit of their money where their mouth is, or the local government, to buy up parkland. So instead of constantly pressuring private developers to contribute, lands for preservation and recreation, the balance requires that sometimes the government step up, sell a bond issue or something to put the money in to buy the most sensitive areas of land and truly hold them in public ownership. So it needs to, the regulatory moves ahead or develops and becomes accepted by the development community, the regulatory, when there is also this other hand that says, yeah, but you know, we'll put our money in, we'll buy it from you when it's really that important, when the land is that valuable for preservation purposes. In 1995, the Burt J. Harris Act in Florida is a statute that allows a property owner to seek payment or redress when the impact of a regulation causes a diminution of value that doesn't rise to the level of a regulatory taking. So it's, it was kind of groundbreaking at the time it was adopted. The standard had always been the government can regulate to the very line of causing a taking. And now in Florida, under this statute, no, if the property owner can prove that the regulation has caused a diminution in value, they can seek redress for something short of a regulatory taking. And the bottom line is there's a very specialized group of lawyers who do that work, and you need to hire one of them, because it's a very fiddly statute. I'm not one of them. In 2005, what was called, it was known at the time as SB 360, then there were two SB 360. It strengthened concurrency in certain respects. The idea of one of the concepts of the growth management law was to say you have to do elements of a comprehensive plan that study the infrastructure, and you have to be consistent. One reason was to make sure that infrastructure would be in place to serve the development when the development happened. That it would be available concurrent with the impact of development. So if you own land in western Palm Beach County and you're building an enormous single-family development in phases, the concurrency concept says you can build water and sewer for one phase at a time. That's fine. You don't have to build the water and sewer for the entire project, as long as the services are available concurrent with the impact of development. And that whole concept was strengthened, especially with regard to traffic in 2005, 6, 7, through the late 2000s. So then, in 2010, the state started releasing more of these regulatory interests back to local governments. In what they defined as dense urban land areas, very urbanized areas like Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, Tampa, Orlando, those urbanized areas, they stopped requiring DRI review. They released the state review of concurrency issues back to the local government. So we see the rollback. So the state said, local governments, you're not doing a very good job. We're going to mandate all of this. And then local governments responded, and they started doing a better job, and they hired professional planners, and they started doing all of that. So the state, and I think that has something to do with Republican governor, Republican legislature, but they started pulling back from that regulation and leaving it more to local governments again. I'll make this available to you guys, the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to think what I wanted to go back and get for the history.
Oh yeah, the cartoon you said. Do you know how they structured the bright line? Because I have to imagine that's going to cut through so many different cities. Well, it is going to cut through so many different cities, and it could be a commercial area, a residential.
Yeah, I
don't
mean,
know how much noise it makes.
they had, in a sense, the FEC had the right to do it anyway. They had the right to put the trains through.
Okay.
Where they had a challenge was in the location of the new nodes, the new stations. And then they've had a battle in north of Palm Beach County where the train goes through but doesn't stop. because the residents in those areas feel that they're getting all the burden and none of the benefit.
None of the benefit.
So they've had some issues there. So Florida, again, why does a growth management structure like we've talked about, why does it develop in a state like Florida and maybe not in Georgia, or certainly not in Texas? Initially because of natural resources. Florida has a lot of sensitive natural resources, wetlands, coastal areas, coastal dunes, protect species that they want to protect from disappearing off the face of the earth. And Florida is a very appealing place to live. Okay, you lived in the Northeast, and now you live here in the sunshine. Well, it's not very sunshiny today, but population moved here. The population increases in Florida were increasing. So not only were we getting people every year, we were getting more and more people every year. And the effect on the natural world from the influx of population was not being managed well. They were coming. If you build it, they will come, or they're coming. Where do we put them? And that was really the problem in Florida is they are going to come for the sunshine, the fact that we don't have any state income tax, for all these different reasons. They're going to come to Florida, and we have to put them someplace. We have to build homes for them, and schools for them, and parks for them, and we have to make sure we don't destroy the beauty of our world through the process. Shifting economies. So tourism here, there was always an economy in Florida of tourism, agriculture. It's hard for us here in South Florida to know how big agriculture is in Florida, but it is a huge industry. Sugarcane fields and beyond. Retirement living, and then new industries that were going to be coming. Nobody could envision. In reality, one of the challenges in Florida is, what kind of state are we? I mean, every time we go through an election cycle, don't you feel like we're really actually 3 different states? You know, there's Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward counties, and there's the rest of the state, but now the I-4 corridor is really becoming a world, you know, of its own, and then there's the north part of the state, which might as well be South Georgia.
I can tell another positive aspect is that Latin America always coming here. European people is coming to South Florida because of the economy in our country.
Yes.
And there's a lot of investment from foreign people, and
Yes.
it's growing a lot in South Florida right now.
Yes, the international business effect here in South Florida has become very significant, yes.
I know that before the financial crisis of 2008, there was a lot of condo construction in South Florida, but after that, it affected the condo, the sales of condos, whereas nobody was buying these condos, so instead a lot of building owners would turn them into rentals. But I also know that, as you mentioned, there's no sales tax, so that a lot of these local governments rely on property taxes.
No
But-
income tax. No income tax.
Sorry, I mean, no income, so there's no income tax. So with a lot of new construction with that rental buildings, how would that affect in terms of the state and local governments obtaining these tax receipts?
Well, one reason that the state had to adopt legislation and mandate comprehensive planning was because of that tension between local governments who depended on ad valorem taxation for their budgets and the state interest in protecting the environment and the quality of life. The local government had the authority to approve development, and every development that got built contributed to their tax base, which added to their tax revenue. So they had a tendency to approve things that were too big, not well planned, didn't have infrastructure for, because they needed the tax base. And the legislature is the one who tells them what the maximum millage rate is that they can charge. So there was tension. The state has said, you're going to do it, and you're going to do it our way, and we're not going to give you any money to do it. How do you like that? And the local governments were struggling to comply and still maintain their tax base in the face of that. So that's why it took a long time. It took that 78 Act all through the 85 Act to try to really get this comprehensive planning process in place because of that disconnect. The local governments had a tendency to approve projects without the right support systems in place because they wanted the tax revenue. That's how it happened. That's how we got unplanned communities in Florida to begin with. The influx of retirement, people moving to Florida for their retirement created some conflict also. As young families grew in Florida, there was a disconnect between what the older retirement communities wanted and what the cities needed to develop for younger families. The cost of infrastructure, correcting existing deficiencies is a continuing problem in Florida. All of those developments that were approved improvidently without adequate infrastructure in place, now the new developers who come along need to put adequate infrastructure in place, but is it their job to correct the existing deficiencies? Legally, no, but the cities are stuck with how do they solve this problem? So financing of corrective infrastructure has been an issue, has been a challenge in Florida also. And this was a cartoon, Growthzilla, slowing down or maybe even taming this monster by sharing information and cooperating in growth decisions. It's just so radical. It just may work. Nothing else has. So as much as their interests were conflicting and in tension with one another, the state agencies cooperating with local governments and working together on comprehensive planning, this cartoonist is saying this is what's really needed to tackle this monster called uncontrolled growth.
2007.
Was that the Space Coast Growth
Yeah, it
Management
says
Coalition?
Florida Today at the top right.
Yeah.
It was 2007.
So this is kind of just a graphic that I pulled probably from the state agency that what was created as the Department of Community Affairs is now called the Department of Economic Opportunity. Thank you, Governor Scott. And this is just an outline of the process. There are these state level plans. They drive the development of regional and local plans, and then local land development regulations, and even decisions on individualized projects have to conform to this system. So we went through the history. Okay. So that I kept telling you that we were doing sort of a high-level flyby of the history of land use regulation, and it started with nuisance law. It's controlled on the outside edges by eminent domain law, and then we've got land use regulation in the middle. So we're going to go back and learn a little bit more about the nuisance cases and understand why dealing with land use by individualized court cases was just not enough. It didn't solve the problem. So there was a case called Hadachek versus Sebastian. I said this all got started somewhat at the beginning of the 20th century. This is a 1915 case. It involved a brick manufacturing facility in Los Angeles. And the facility had been there for a long time, and the development of Los Angeles around it caused residential development to come closer and closer and closer to the brick facility until finally the people who lived in those houses said, that is a nasty facility, we don't want it anymore next to our neighborhood. And they filed suit to prevent the continued operation of the brick facility that had been there before their neighborhood ever existed. This is something I encountered as an airport lawyer, where they're out in Pembroke Pines. There is a small general aviation airport, North Perry Airport, that was built after World War II. It had been a World War II training facility and then given to the local government after the war. And it was surrounded by farmland. And eventually homes were built right up to its perimeter. And then the people who bought those homes complained about the airport. They're like, but we've been here, we've always been here all along. And this case dealt with that kind of scenario. And the court held that the owner could be held responsible for the nuisance, even though the residential came to him, because to hold otherwise, to hold that the owner had an unlimited, forever and ever, hallelujah, amen, right to have a brick facility, no matter what grew up around him, to so hold would preclude development and fix a city forever in its primitive conditions. There must be progress, and if in its march private interests are in the way, they must yield to the good of the community.
So, how was
That
this
kind of
resolved?
answers the supermarket question.
Yeah, this was in 1915 in California. But this wasn't a regulatory case, this was a private nuisance action. I live next to you, I don't like what you're doing in your brick facility, you're harming my property, I'm gonna sue you.
How does that, I mean, you drive down the turnpike and you drive by, you know, the mounds of trash,
Mhm.
sometimes the wind's blowing and now it smells, so now that your house has been there for 15 years, now you can say, I don't like the smell, it's always been there. So how does this not go back to that? I mean,
This is one case that made one decision about one piece of property in one set of circumstances at one time. Does it strike you as this might not be the way to regulate land by filing lawsuits over individual nuisance actions? Another early land use case was in Pennsylvania in 1922. So there is mineral rights were commonly sold separately from surface rights in Pennsylvania at this period of time. And when then a residence was developed on top of an area that was subject to mining rights, and when the mining began, it caused subsidence, and the man who owned the house on the surface tried to stop the mining. And the mining company was like, you know, dude, we always had the right to mine here. You knew that when you bought the surface rights and built your house there. This was the underlying facts of this case. So the quote is, the government can hardly go on if to some extent values incident to the property could not be diminished without paying for every such change in general law. But the implied limitation must have its limits. When it reaches a certain magnitude, in most, if not all cases, there must be an exercise of eminent domain. So this is trying to find those outer limits of how much can you diminish value without having a taking. This was one of the very earliest cases that explored this. When a regulatory action constitutes a taking, depends upon the extent to which the action reduces the property's value. So this was a nuisance case, which was just a single party suing another party and trying to get some relief in court. This Pennsylvania coal case first dealt with a regulatory issue. So in Pennsylvania at this time, eventually there was outcry that the uncontrolled mining was causing the subsidence of residential areas, and the legislature passed a law that said you can't do anything, mining companies, that's going to cause damage to a residence. And they were arguing about whether that constituted a taking of the mining company's rights. So this was one of the very earliest regulatory takings cases.
you know, something that's kind of relatively going on now is fracking in the Midwest. And I think there's a correlation, or so it's been said, between the fracking activities and earthquakes.
And the water.
Well, not just the water, but specifically the earth shaking close to these fracking sites. I mean, that's kind of an indirect.
I mean, it's reminiscent of these old early 20th century cases, but first of all, it's happening in a world that has a well-developed set of environmental regulations now, okay? They didn't back in the early 20s. So the mining companies that are using fracking, they can't do it without complying with a complex set of regulations to begin with. So it's all being overseen by government already. You may like or not like, or believe or not believe the conclusions that the government reaches about whether the fracking should be permitted, but it is being supervised in a regulatory setting now, when in these early days, it really wasn't. It was all about property rights. It was all simply, I have the right to dig, I will dig. And there was no oversight. But that Pennsylvania Coal case was the first time that a court was asked to determine if the effect of a regulation could constitute a taking. That was the very first inverse condemnation case that I'm aware of. So how do we get from nuisance cases to zoning? And that's what I want you to see in the history here. So those nuisance cases, like Hadachek, and there were many like that would have been similar to the supermarket case. They had their limitations. They were limited to those specific parties. That particular property, that particular set of facts. They didn't provide a solution for anyone else in the community. They didn't tell the next guy down the street what he could or couldn't build. Because, well, I filed a nuisance action about your trees and I solved the problem by suing you, but that doesn't tell the neighbor whether she has to remove her nuisance tree. See what I mean? It wasn't a very good way of solving the problem on a community-wide basis, was to just let complaining people sue each other. These cases delivered disparate results. A different judge on a different day might have decided Hadachek differently. It was a close call. And they provided no future protections for residences. So using the tort system of people suing one another for individual actions didn't seem like a good way to regulate land use. The next significant case here is called Euclid versus Amber Realty. Who's ever heard the term Euclidean zoning? Is that something that you've ever heard before? If you do, and if you're reading, this is the source of it, is this case. A town adopted a zoning scheme. Okay, nobody was asking them for a permit, nobody was suing over a nuisance. They said proactively, we'd like to have a beautiful town, we're going to adopt a scheme of what you can build where, and adopt it and make it law. And this was the first case that upheld that as a valid governmental action, was this case. It upheld the validity of a comprehensive zoning scheme that established permitted uses within zones. And industrial use was prohibited in residential zoning, and the court held that that kind of local law establishing a community-wide zoning scheme was constitutional. It was a valid exercise of governmental authority, and it was supported by public purpose. And Euclidean zoning became the standard zoning structure for really the rest of the 20th century. The idea that incompatible uses should be separated from one another and permitted in zones to ensure the separation of incompatible uses. That's why you have residential zoning, you have commercial zoning, you have industrial zoning. Was the separation of uses, they didn't really know any other way to protect residential areas from the negative effects of commerce or industry, was other than separating them. And so that was the basic zoning scheme that came into play in the United States. Swing to the other end, we have an example in this Penn Central case of a zoning regulation that went too far. The zoning regulations affected the use of airspace above historic property, and that zoning regulation was alleged to be a regulatory taking. And the standard that was established in that case by the United States Supreme Court was whether the economic impact of the regulation destroyed the reasonable investment-backed expectation of the property owner. And this case first raised the possibility of the idea of transfer of development rights. So, and you're really a Miami guy. In Miami today and in cities like Miami, there are provisions that allow you to sell above historic properties. So you own a historic property and you can sell the air rights. Nobody's actually going to build there, but you sell it to someone else to use the density on another piece of property. Transferable development rights. It was one way of mitigating the effect of the regulation for historic property protection. Just a second, Dan.
There's a building around the same time frame where there was a historical church in New York City that was willing to sell its air rights to a commercial builder, in this case the old or former city tower. They were allowing them to build on top of their air rights, on the exception that they would build no floors or like an open space on the first several floors.
This kind of system exists in Miami now. I have a client who owns a historic church property in downtown Miami, and they have a certificate that says they have a certain number, a million plus square feet of TDRs that they can sell. At one point, they were selling for about $7 a square foot to other developers to build taller elsewhere in downtown Miami.
I was gonna say, if you have an adjacent lot, can you use that as part of your footprint?
It all depends on the regulations. What's the contributing site and what can be the receiving site of TDRs is all going to have to be defined by regulation. But it was suggested, this was the first time in the case law where the idea of the air rights above a historic property having a value that could be separated, and that could be important to the preservation of the history itself. The idea that if you own a historic property, you can't maintain it, and you let it deteriorate over time, it's going to lose its historic value. But if you can sell the development rights that you're never going to use because it's a historic property, if you can sell them and use those proceeds to maintain the historic property, everybody wins, right?
What's TDR?
Transferable development rights.
And that came into play again with the deterioration of Grand Central Station.
Yeah, this was having to do with Penn Central, but it's probably been a similar discussion over Grand Central. Yeah.
And also develop like a historical registry of buildings as well.
There's a federal register. There's usually state registers, and cities can designate historic properties that are just of local significance too. We'll spend some time on historic property regulation and how that affects development. And it has become a tool of anti-growth folks to try to slow growth in areas by advocating for the designation of historic sites that might or might not be historic. Okay, so we've gotten to this point. Zoning regulations and environmental regulations are an exercise of the police power. We've used the phrase police power, and this is the definition. It really doesn't have anything to do with police. It's the inherent right of government to enact and enforce regulations for the protection of the public health, safety, welfare, and morals. So for a regulation to be a valid exercise of the police power, there must be a connection, a nexus between the perceived harm to be prevented and the requirements of the regulation. So let's come up with some silly examples. If there's a regulation, I'm trying to think of a good disconnect example. So they say, the government says you can't remove trees unless you repaint your house. Okay, if there's a negative effect of removing trees, the loss of canopy, the loss of shade value, the fact that the whole community heats up, whatever the value is of having trees, is that going to be improved at all by requiring you to paint your house? So there's no nexus between the regulation, the requirements of the regulation, and the harm that's sought to be remedied. Those are the requirements of the police power. The regulation must be directed to the protection of the public health, safety, welfare, Morals, we don't see too much in these regulations anymore. Nobody's too concerned about regulating them anyway. The protection of public health, safety, and welfare, or, okay, go ahead.
Example, morals, there's a strip club in Fort Lauderdale, Solid Gold, and it's right in the community.
Oakland Park and,
Yes, my friend owns
Yeah,
it.
right.
oh, really?
And he's losing his business.
Because of the regulation required him to close it over a period of time?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the morality of the club being what it is. Yes.
Okay, so let's use that as an example. And there was early in my career, one of the things I did was, I was a baby lawyer, I was really not good for much at all, and my boss was handling a zoning case that had to do with the regulation of adult nightclubs. The zoning regulation said adult nightclubs can't be closer than 1,000 feet to a residential area, a church, or a school. And there was a club in Pompano at the time that was closer than that, that had opened in a building that was closer than that to a residence. So the county filed suit against the club operator to try to enjoin the operation of the adult nightclub in that location. And there was a federal lawsuit because the adult nightclub operator asserted that putting on dance shows was a First Amendment protected activity. It was expressive activity. And in fact, there's a long line of Supreme Court cases that hold that to be true. That exotic dancing is a protected activity, just like speech. So that was how the lawsuit got set. And I helped her with the case because she really didn't know what else to do with me. I didn't know how to do anything. I was a new lawyer. And we went to trial. I second chaired the trial, and then we won at trial. And the adult nightclub owner appealed, and I handled the appeal in the federal, in the 11th Circuit. And then he tried to get relief from the United States Supreme Court, and so I got to file a brief in the Supreme Court opposing cert. So the case was never taken by the Supreme Court. But in those cases, really, they were not regulating morals. In order for the regulation to be found valid, there was a city in Washington called Renton that the city of Renton case is the one that held this. They said you had to show that the secondary effects of an adult nightclub were worse than the secondary effects of a regular nightclub. More police calls, more prostitution, more drug use, more negative effects for the neighborhood from an adult nightclub than from a regular nightclub. And then you can regulate, if you can show that, local government, then you can regulate adult nightclubs more stringently than you regulate regular nightclubs. But, and the other way that they regulate adult nightclubs is through liquor licensing. That's a whole different issue. But the zoning, so let's get back to the definition of police power. The power of government to enact and enforce regulations for the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. So let's think of some areas of regulation. So the idea that every taxi driver has to have a license to drive a taxi. What does that
Public
kind
health.
of regulation do to protect the public health, safety, and welfare?
The actual driver's license or the taxi license?
The taxi license.
Yeah, it means that they have a background check. I know that they check their backgrounds, and they don't have any mental problems.
Okay. Does that protect the public health and safety?
Yes.
To do that, to regulate in that area. Okay, what about a regulation that says that your children must be in school or the parents can be fined for truancy? Is that a regulation that protects the public health, safety, and welfare?
I have a trick problem with that.
Yeah.
I mean, you can homeschool them.
Okay.
Homeschool, like somebody else
Okay.
said.
Maybe, maybe not. What if there's a regulation that says you can only paint your house one of these 3 colors?
Snob rules. Snob rules. It's not rules.
Okay, it gets a little closer, whether that actually enhances the public health, safety, and welfare. But that's really the standard. When I was a local government lawyer and one of the commissioners wanted to have a new regulation adopted, I had to come up with the rationale, and I put it right in the law to say, because this is a problem, because that's a problem, and everybody's suffering with these problems, we're adopting these rules to fix that problem. Every single law has to be supported that way. And zoning laws are the same way. They have to be adopted for the purpose of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. There are many private deed restrictions. If you have any reason to review the title documents for property that, when the title goes back a long way, you'll find restrictions that say no Jewish people can live here. Those kind of restrictions used to actually be in regulations. And at some point, someone woke up and said, that's not a legitimate regulation. That does not protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Not valid. And now they're not valid in private deed
How did
restrictions.
you defend the color of the homes? Because I mean, like, I'll go to Nantucket sometimes, and your homes can only be X, Y, Z. And that's a whole island.
It's a whole category of land use regulation for aesthetics.
It's not rules.
Sometimes it can be because they want the neighbor, they want the city to have a character. It'll be part of a whole set of architectural regulations. So, yeah, they do now. I mean, there are parts of Pompano
I know they
that
have.
you
I
have
just
to
wonder
have
how they-
Mediterranean hoo-ha, whatever the definition is of the type of architecture. So they support it because they say everybody's property is maintained at a better level. Everyone is
Gotcha.
compatible. It creates a character that contributes to the
So
safety, the
protecting
security,
the
the value
property
of the
value.
company. The aesthetic regulations are tough, but they're generally upheld because a court relies on the fact that the locally elected officials are using their discretion for the advancement of their own community. And again, most of them are not too burdensome. If you only have 3 colors to choose from, it's really not going to damage your property value too much to comply with that regulation. You may not like it, but it's not harmful to your property value to comply with an aesthetic regulation most of the time. Some of them, a partner of mine who's an architect also, he once sued the city in which he lived because their regulations prohibited metal roof structures on houses. They wanted to have ceramic tile, and he wanted to have a metal roof system, and he sued them and he lost.
Was this in the coastal area?
It was in Coral Gables, I think. And the public health, safety, and welfare benefit of the regulation has to be tied with, there has to be a connection between the harm that you seek to avoid and the requirements of the regulation. We'll see in some other cases how a disconnect can happen there. So Nolan, this is a very famous case, Nolan versus California Coastal Commission, 1987, the United States Supreme Court. It's in California. So the Nolans had land on the beach in California. They sought a permit to demolish an existing beachfront bungalow and construct a new house. The Coastal Commission, remember we talked about all these different levels of regulation? In California, it's called the Coastal Commission. Required as a condition that the Nolans dedicate a lateral public easement parallel to the ocean across their property. Okay, so you're picturing somebody's got a lot on the beach. There's a small house. They want to put a new house there. And the Coastal Commission said, you've got to allow the public to traverse the private beach laterally, like side to side, so that somebody can walk from one end of the beach to the other. The asserted public purpose for this condition was to maintain public view of the ocean. The court held that there must be a rational nexus between the legitimate public purpose protecting public view of the ocean, and the condition.
Anthony Scalia?
Yep. Justice Scalia wrote, unless the permit condition serves the same governmental purpose as the development ban, the building restriction is not a valid regulation of land use, but it's an out-and-out plan of extortion. You can imagine that particular justice saying something like that. He was like the farthest right wing of the Supreme Court before his death. So here he's requiring that connection. So there was nothing about a lateral easement down the beach that served or advanced the declared public purpose of protecting views to the beach. There was a disconnect. What we're asking you to give us isn't really going to serve the purpose that we're asking for. Make sense? So this was the rational nexus requirement. This is one of the two big rules by which we judge the validity of a land use regulation. The Nolan rule. There must be a rational nexus between a legitimate public purpose and the condition that's imposed. Okay, they sound a lot alike, but Nolan has two L's, Dolan has one L. Dolan versus the city of Tigard. I think this came out of California also. It might have been Oregon or something. So this was a 1994 Supreme Court case. Dolan sought to expand, she had a hardware store. She had an adjacent parking lot, and she wanted to expand her store and pave the grass parking lot next to her store. The city required as conditions to the approval that she dedicate land for a greenway along an adjacent creek and install a pedestrian and bicycle pathway. This sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it, to what we might encounter in a Florida development project?
Yes, recent plantation acres.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court held that the essential nexus existed between the conditions. Okay, so remember what fouled them up in the Nolan, in the Nolan case, I get these names confused too, was that there was no nexus between the regulation and the harm. Here, it passed that test. So there was a rational nexus between the conditions and the impact of the proposed development. But the degree of the exactions did not bear a reasonable relationship to the projected impact of the development. So for enlarging her hardware store by X square foot, what the city asked for was just too much. It made sense that she would have to do some off-site dedication or improvement, but what they were asking for was just too much. There was a rational nexus, but it wasn't reasonable. It didn't bear a reasonable proportion to the harm or the impact of what she proposed to do. These are really the two big rules by which we judge the validity of land use regulation. Is there a rational nexus between the harm and the regulation? And is it a reasonable proportion in terms of the impact? And you know what? When you guys are all big developers, and you'll hire lawyers if you encounter something like this, but I want your ears to become tuned to those kind of requirements. When you're reading the conditions that have been imposed on your development by the various committees of the city, when you become familiar with these, one or more of them can jump out at you and say, you know what, this is disproportionate. Our firm represents a developer, in Weston, and I think there was so much money to be made that they actually agreed to give all of the property necessary for a fire station. But there was a time, early in that development process, when the city asked the development of 180 homes to build the fire station that was going to serve, 20% of the city.
What?
That jumped right out at us and said, this is disproportionate. Go ahead.
What happened to Arvida?
What happened to Arvida?
Yeah.
The builders?
Yeah.
In what way?
I don't know. I don't see any of their stuff anymore.
Oh, they were bought. They've been bought and
They were bought.
At one point, they were owned by, I think, Disney, and they were bought by. I don't know if they exist anymore, but they were the original developer of Weston.
Like Savannah makes up 20% of the population of Weston, so you would think that they would be responsible for up to 20%, right? Or would that not be just insane?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
The population of Savannah, which is a master plan community